Chapter 1 in your text is the importance of business ethics. When you think about what business ethics really is, it's the standard that people set within that business that's going to guide the behavior of that. There's principles, that's kind of the specific boundaries that are out there. In other words, the law is put into place that says this is what is expected. This is absolute universal behavior that is expected. Whereas the value on the other end is going to be the thing that is socially enforced but maybe doesn't have a law attached to it. Now, why are we studying business ethics anyway? Well, I'm sure from reading the headlines already you know that there is a crisis in business ethics. Unethical behavior just seems to be on the rise because our society seems to have lost the difference between right and wrong. There was a survey of teens that were taken, I think it was a Deloitte and Touche survey that was taken that showed that 71% of all of the teens that were surveyed felt as though they were ready to make good ethical decisions in the workplace. Now, out of these people that were ready to make these decisions, 38% of them thought that it was okay to sometimes, you just need to lie. It's kind of like adults sometimes have to lie. Have you ever watched that movie Liar, Liar with Jim Carrey? And that's what he says at the beginning. Sometimes adults just have to lie. Well, 25% of these teens thought that it was okay to cheat on a test. I mean, after all, your grade depended on it. If you had a reason, maybe you were up late the night before, you had all of this different kinds of practices that you had to go to, you could easily justify your decision. Oh, and by the way, copying somebody else's answers, that wasn't cheating. They didn't even consider that to be cheating. Check out the picture here. This is pretty funny. This one's taking a look. This one has his notes down below. I believe I see a cell phone going on here. All sorts of cheating going on in this picture. And that is truly what's happening in our classrooms today. It's also happening in our business world today because there is a crisis in business ethics. Consumers in America no longer trust businesses. They think that they're going to be making decisions that are bad for our country. No sector is exempt from this. It could be the athletics that are on the steroids. It could be government. Heavens knows we've had some high-profile politicians recently that have had ethical issues that's been made public in the news. It doesn't matter what the sector is. Ethical misconduct seems to be rampant everywhere. In fact, there was a recent poll where 88% of those polled felt as though corporate America's reputation was not good. In fact, it was terrible. Well, is it good enough just to be a good person? Is it good enough for a company to hire just good people? Would that be enough to make business ethics back on the rise again, to make an ethical company that would be making good, sound, moral decisions? Well, actually, just being a good person is not sufficient to handle those ethical issues that sometimes arise. If we take a look at the timeline of where business ethics has come from, we can go back to the 60s. Back in that time period is about the time that you had environmental issues that started to come about, civil rights because of integration in the school systems and in the workplace. We had a changing work ethic at that time in the 60s. Of course, you also have to remember that in the 60s it was free love, drugs, lots and lots of abusive behavior going on. In the 70s, more human rights issues, more covering up than correcting things, quite different from the 60s. In the 80s, we started to experience deceptive advertising and, of course, the financial fraud, because we had the big savings and loan industry that, was buried in a scandal for certain. In the 1990s, we had issues with factories that were third world factories that were performing the needs of our factories here. Cybercrime, of course, was on the rise in the 2000s, and you can see the other things that are on this timeline. Well, just very briefly, we wanted to discuss before 1960 and then after 1960, but basically up until before 1960, government was involved in some extent, but mostly ethical discussions occurred in the family or at church. Social issues came to the forefront in the 60s. America started turning to causes. You also had the JFK Consumer Bill of Rights, which meant that the consumers had the right to be safe, they had the right to be informed, they had the right to be heard, and all of those types of things started emerging. In the 70s, academics came on board with the churches and the family, and business professors started to write about the corporate social responsibility. By the way, what is social responsibility? That's when you want to try to maximize your positive impact and minimize the negative impact. In the 80s, the Defense Industry Initiative came about, and there are 6 different principles that were put into place at that point. This is kind of the Reagan-Bush era, which ushered in a time period of self-regulation rather than depending on the government to regulate it for you. In the 90s, the Clinton administration took over, and yes, they continued with the defense industry initiatives that were put in place in the decade before, but now they started also taking action on health-related social issues, such as, for example, teenage smoking, teenage pregnancies, etc. The FSGO came about as a direct response to the defense industry initiatives, because now that you have companies that were really not a part of the defense industry making or supplying any of those parts, instead it was a company that you wanted them to have the same standards as these defense contractors, even though they weren't working for that. And so in order to do that, they decided to hang a carrot outside their nose, basically, which meant that they were welcome to come. In the 21st century, it's been a brand new world. Of course, we still have continued issues because there's so many businesses that are not in compliance, but the Sarbanes-Oxley Act had to be put into place because of all of the accounting fraud that happened in the latter 90s and the early 2000s. Remember that the firm's greatest danger could be simply being late in detecting a misconduct. I thought it was rather unusual that if you thought about the misconduct by industry, that America felt as though the automotive or the government was really the ones that were getting to them. An ethical culture is basically what a company says is right or wrong. If you have an ethical culture of the company that, allows freedom, easy come, easy go, come in when you want to come in, don't worry about writing down your time, that's going to be an acceptable behavior for that company. That is the ethical culture in that company, whereas the company right next door might be totally opposite from that. This is usually driven by the top person on down, because that person is going to pretty much set the tone for the business. Now, what would be some different benefits that a company would derive from practicing business ethics? One of them would be employee commitment. They're going to be more committed to the company because the greater that the company is dedicated to the employee just means that that employee is just that much more dedicated to the company. Investor loyalty would be another one of the benefits, because shareholder loyalty would certainly contribute to the success of a company. You don't want your investors going elsewhere. Customers will continue to return to a place where they are satisfied. Being good can be extremely profitable in this instance. And of course, when all of those things work together, it works together for good for the company as well, because profits would be growing. You'll have sales growth as well as a return on your investments. There's definitely a positive relationship between citizenship